This year has been a year of incredible change. The COVID pandemic has led to quarantines, a boom for companies like Amazon and Walmart, and an economic scare for others. QAnon has been declared a domestic terrorist threat, while Antifa is said to be nothing more than an idea. We have a presidential election between two men in their 70s who are both hated by some and loved by others. The media bias has fractured global trust in journalism as a whole. We all watched as George Floyd took his final breaths in what united most Americans around the need for police reform, but quickly divided us when, for some, reform became a demand for the abolishment of the police. With all of these polarizing moments, I have watched the church begin to fracture and choose sides. This, for any Christ follower, should be problematic at best. Some have confronted me for being too outspoken, and others have attempted to challenge my silence. I am a learner. It's one of my 5 strengths. Check out StrengthsFinder 2.0 if you want to know what that means. So I slowed down and began to listen to what people were saying. Among the many shared articles and stories, I keep hearing certain terms being used. Terms like Marxist, fascist, communist, socialist, anarchist, Antifa, authoritarian, and even witches. Some say the idea of any of these worldviews resurfacing is just the boogeyman coming to get us. Any concern that is raised that there may be motives at work that aren't in our best interest are chalked up to nothing more than conspiracy theories. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the X-Files as much as the next nerd, but are these really conspiracy theories? Like many of you, I felt like I had a pretty good understanding as to what these ideas represent. They're bad, right? Then why are Christ followers aligning with different groups that claim these terms represent their ideologies? The only thing I knew to do was start researching, and that's what I did. I began by reading the Communist Manifesto. What I discovered is far beyond conspiracy or coincidence. It's dark and it's evil. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to break down what I have learned about each of these ideologies and how it is not possible to be a believer and be in support of their worldview. Does this mean that a group that aligns with these ideologies are somehow void of anything we might align with? No, of course not. I've heard it said by some pastors that Christians can partner with organizations that align with worldviews like these and just steer clear of the bad parts. I have to say no to that. You see, we are told not to walk with the wicked. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 10, it says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." It goes on in verse 15 to say, "My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths." Then in Psalm chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." Our mission as believers can and should be to bring some of the very changes we identify our nation and world needs, but not at the expense of our testimony. Here's how passionate I am about this. I do not see it as an opinion or an option. As a follower of Christ, I am bound to denounce sin and not walk hand in hand with the wicked, period. Does this mean I never sin? Of course not. It means I do not knowingly partner with organizations or groups of people that by their own doctrinal admission seek to silence and abolish the faith. Does that sound harsh? It won't once I walk you through their own writings. In the end, I will share with you what I believe ties many of these together and the spiritual implications of their partnerships. Yes, their partnerships. Many of the ideologies I mentioned are partnering together, and this should concern us. Please, I ask this of you. Hear me out. No. Today, hear Marx out. I'll be sharing in his own words. If you hear what he has to say and you think I'm wrong, so be it. I'm just asking that you hear it out. Now, is it biased? Yes, of course. It is Jesus biased. It is 100% biased by my calling as a pastor. Today, I want to start with Marxism. A cursory glance at how one should view Marx can be summed up by Google's recommendation from the article, "The Problem of Capitalism, The Birth of Consumption" by Jean Willett. As philosophers who inherited the goals of the Enlightenment, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels believed the main theme was freedom. Freedom to become a full human being, creating oneself through free choices. They attributed a high value to the human personality and believed that making a life was distinct from making a thing. Now, is this a genuine glimpse into what it means to be a trained Marxist? Does this align with the writings of Marx? To answer this question, we need to go back to 1818 in Trier, Germany, where a Jew from a line of rabbis named Karl Marx is born into a family that is Christian. While his extended family chose Catholicism, his dad chose to be a Lutheran because he felt it gave his family more freedom. Marx would remain a believer until he went to college. Oh, how times change. It was there he would meet Bruno Bauer, his theology professor. Bruno, like far too many theology professors, was an atheist, not believing the very things he was charged with teaching. Together, they began writing, and ironically, Marx would become radicalized and an outspoken anti-Semitic. Marx had a passion for poetry. He wrote during this season of his life, "Then I will wander, godlike and victorious, through the ruins of the world, and giving my words an active force, I will feel equal to the Creator." In 1837, Karl's dad wrote to his son, just 1 year before his death, saying, "Since that heart," speaking of Karl's heart, "is obviously animated and governed by a demon not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian?" For those of you who are not aware, Faust was a German astronomer and necromancer reputed to have sold his soul to the devil. Faust was a man that Marx idolized and often quoted. Having never completed his studies at college, he went on to try and find a career. Marx had developed a lifestyle of reckless spending and had been, on more than one occasion, sued for not paying his debts. With his father dead, his mother was not going to indefinitely support Karl. He would write to a friend, "Although they are quite rich, my family has placed difficulties in my way which have temporarily put me in an embarrassing situation." This would be the pattern for the remainder of his life. Marx wanted the wealth of his family and resented them for not giving it to him. In the 1840s, he and his wife would meet Friedrich Engels. Together, they would connect with other radicals and begin writing. Marx would soon put out his first book, The Conditions of the Working Class. Marx and Engels would create an alliance that made it very difficult to determine what was Marx's and what was Engels in terms of writing. In fact, after Marx's death, his daughter would accidentally publish a work written by Engels as having been written by Marx. The pair happened upon the League of the Just, not to be mistaken for the Justice League, who were in the process of reorganizing to become the Communist League. Marx and Engels joined and together wrote what is arguably their most famous and influential work, and what I believe is the best picture of what it means to be a trained Marxist. It's called the Communist Manifesto. Here it is. I read through it 3 times. We'll discuss it in just a moment. Shortly after writing it, they both moved to Germany. That was until Engels was issued a warrant for inciting violence. He fled to Sweden, enjoying food and women the entire way. Engels, a womanizer, wrote to Marx, "If I had an income of 5,000 francs, I would do nothing but work and amuse myself with women until I went to pieces. If there were no French women, life would not be worth living." By 1849, they both would end up in England, where they would live out the remainder of their days exiled because of their part in the violence of what they called the Revolution. At age 30, Engels accepted an offer from his father to work in a family business in Manchester. He would call this forced labor, complaining, "I've now got to be at the office no later than 10 in the morning." Marx would move into the slums and bury himself in his study of economics until the late 1860s, when Engels would, through the success of his father's efforts through capitalism, be able to provide an income for him. Once Marx was able to move back into the upper class, he all but stopped his writing and life's work. So what does it mean to be a Marxist? I have not read all of his books, but I think a good place to start is here with the Communist Manifesto. I found this writing to be less about communism, which was already an ideology being developed by others, and more about Marxist views on society. This opinion will, no doubt, be scoffed at by Marxists, but I think it'll work for our purposes. So, let's define a couple of heavily used terms in Marxist writings before we start. The bourgeoisie. This is the capitalist class who own most of society's wealth and means of production. The proletarians, a working class person, or any partner/ally as prescribed by Marxist writings. Marx says, the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Let's take note here that Marx believed that fundamentally people need to be living in urban city centers. This was a requirement for the framework of his vision to reach its potential. He goes on, further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. There will be those who gain enlightenment and will become allies. They will have incredible influence and wealth. Again, he says, finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. So there must come a point in which society is collapsing and is given the image of being violent and lacking character so as to help portions of the ruling class cut themselves free and come to the revolutionary class. Note that term, revolutionary class. He says, the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are, therefore, not revolutionary, but conservative. Marx wants to make sure that it is understood that if you aren't with them, you aren't with them. If you are not a member of the revolutionary class, you are a conservative, and that makes you the enemy. There is no middle ground. He says, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. The whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air? He claims it's going to require complete upheaval. The question is, where does this upheaval happen? Well, I'm glad you asked. He says, though not in a substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. It must happen worldwide. This is not simply a national movement. It requires activists working in unison around the world. Now, in chapter 2, Marx begins connecting his views to an already existing social theory called communism. He says, the immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeoisie supremacy, conquest of a political power by the proletariat. See, this allows the true Marxists to partner with other groups who share certain values, but not necessarily all values. Ultimately, together, they will overthrow the wealthy and take over the political power. In our society, this would make the 1% the enemy and any politician that defends them. This is irregardless of that individual's human rights. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. Let's talk about property rights as Christians. After all, I told you I wanted to connect the dots on why an ideology like Marxism is out of sync with Christianity. There is a divide on the view of private property in Scripture. That divide finds itself running the same lines that divide people politically. I'll start with the 8th commandment, not to steal. It's apparent to most that this insinuates possession on behalf of someone. From here, we receive instruction on how to manage property and possessions through selling, contracts, and loans. Then we get to Acts, and the church is made up of people entering into an agreement to sell all that they possess and distribute it to any as there is need. Does this give us the precedents we need to do away with private property? No, it really just does not. Here's the thing. As Christians, we are called not to build up possessions at the expense of others. We are to be the first line of defense for a hurting person, a widowed mother, a destitute drifter. It's not a societal contract. It's a covenant that we are a part of. At the end of the day, if a thief wants my truck and the only way to stop them is to take their life, the truck is theirs. People need Jesus. There may be an argument to be made that in eternity there will be no private property, and I might get behind that. As a Christian, if the Lord is stirring you to part with property, then you should. My wife and I have on multiple occasions made huge leaps of faith, giving away major items to bless people in need. Our lives likewise have been radically changed by the generosity of others. This transfer of property is something as Christians we are called to participate in as an act of faith. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 26, "For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind." Solomon says that wealth distribution is a part of God's process, not our government's. Marx keeps it coming. Listen to this. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. His argument is that only the non-revolutionary class has family. Once we get rid of those individuals, well, so we will be rid of family. He goes on to say, "Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social." This gets me fired up because I hear this being said today. Honestly, there is a lot of what Marx says that I am hearing repeated today, but this is a special kind of evil. Marx believed that anyone not a part of the revolutionary class is brainwashing their children and must be stopped. Not convinced? Listen to what he says next. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of the modern industry, all family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. Instead of desiring a restoration of family to all classes of people, he seeks to abolish it. Now, I won't waste your time laying out biblical evidence for why this view of family is simply unacceptable. As parents, we are mandated to raise our children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. It's here that Marx begins addressing religion and faith. He says, the charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Not deserving serious examination? He goes on to say, when the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience did nothing more than open up free competition. These are things Marx finds no value in. Given that we see so much of these ideas regurgitated with modern language today, makes you wonder if this isn't the ultimate goal. And here's the problem, because it gets worse as he continues. Undoubtedly, it will be said religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survived this change. Some will note that in an attempt to modify history, religion and morality seem to survive. It's almost as if there's something guiding it. Marx does not stop. There are, besides eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. Let me say that once more for you. Communism abolishes eternal truths. Ever heard someone say truth is relative? It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. A trained Marxist is not neutral on the faith, they stand against it. That is Marx and Engels' premise behind their many writings. He lays out 10 necessities for revolution. I'll just summarize briefly. Number 1, abolition of property. Number 2, a heavy progressive tax, meaning a graduated tax in which the wealthy pay the most. Abolition of inheritance. I'll remind you, Proverbs 13:22 says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. Number 4, confiscation of all property from rebels, meaning that if you don't fall in line with these ideas, everything is taken from you. Number 5, a national banking system. Number 6, all communication and transportation managed by the government. Does that allow them to monitor where you're going and what you're saying? Number 7, extending factories and instruments of production, all to be owned by the government. Number 8, everyone must labor. Number 9, combine agriculture and manufacturing so as to abolish rural living. Number 10, free education for all children and the abolishment of their labor in factories. I think we can get behind this. Oh, wait, the free market had already begun this process. So, do any of these sound familiar? Absolutely. They are platforms candidates are running on all over the world today. Marxist philosophies have been adapted by modern thinkers who used it to develop critical theory. In short, Marx and Engels did not see Christianity as a group that would create any real resistance. So much so, they mocked them by saying, nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrat. I admit that within Marx and Engels' writings are some points of value, areas that many could get behind, but the problem is what happens if you partner alongside them. I need you to understand this. When someone calls themselves a trained Marxist, they are making known their worldview. It's a worldview that seeks revolution, has no respect for Christianity, declares the abolition of religion a must, and they stand against the model of family that each of us would hold to be biblical. His final statement in the Communist Manifesto sums up his thoughts nicely. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. In the end, if you are a follower of Christ, you simply cannot partner with movements that seek to eradicate your faith. Until Christ returns, we have a responsibility to be a light in the darkness, a city on the hill, salt to the world. Christ is first, and it's time that Marxists everywhere knew this. To the Marxists, if you believe it will be simple to radicalize and conform us, you are wrong. Though many may be deceived, there will be a remnant that will not. We will never renounce the faith. We will never back down from truth. We will never join the wicked movement. Marxism is death, and we serve the one that brings life. Christian men and women of all countries, tribes, and tongues unite. Repent, pray, make way for the return of the King. This is only the tip of what I believe the enemy is doing in our nation and our world. Look for the next part in this series soon. Also, if this touched you, please consider sharing, liking, and commenting. If you're able to support the ministry, visit citychurch.life/give.